Okay, well, welcome everyone. You're either here for Mystic Saints and Sinners, the quest for holiness in the Catholic tradition, or the Jesuit Center's monthly Formations and Reformations in Catholic Thought lecture series. The good news is you're both in the right place. I'm Dr. Meredith Bacola, an assistant professor in the Jesuit Center located within St. Paul's College, the Ignatian tradition at the University of Manitoba. And I'm also the saint enthusiast who coerced our speaker to give a talk this morning. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that both I and the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Our speaker today is Father Robert Goding, who is a Jesuit, and he is also the director of the Société des Bollandistes, a 400-year-old Jesuit apostolate dedicated to critically researching the history of saints and their cults. He will be joining us virtually today from a very sunny Brussels, it looks like, where Father Goding works as a historian and a specialist in Latin hagiography, mainly from the late Antique and early Middle Ages. He is also responsible for the Latin sector of the Bollandistes research, and he teaches hagiography at the Gregorian University in Rome. Please join me in whatever way you virtually can in welcoming Father Goding for today's talk.
Thank you, Meredith. Hello everybody. I shall try to share my screen as we practiced. So, do you see something? Yes, perfect. Now, I should tell you that the name Manitoba is not unknown to me since my early childhood, because I was an avid reader of the adventures of Tintin and also of those two children, Jo and Zette, who were created by the great Heribert, the author of Tintin. And so one of the titles of those comic strips was Le Manitoba ne répond plus. But what was that Manitoba? It was not your state. It was the name of a cruise ship which was taken over by pirates. So a very fascinating story. So I'm very happy for the first time to get in touch with the real Manitoba. Well, we have quite a difficult but fascinating topic today: saints' lives and historical criticism, the Bollandist enterprise. So in order to be well understood, I have to start with a first part, which will be dedicated to a brief survey of the origins and development of the cult of saints and of hagiographic literature. This is necessary in order to understand what was at stake. So you probably remember that since the early church, since the early centuries before Constantine already, the various martyrs which were martyred by the Romans were soon objects of a cult by the various churches where they were killed and buried. And so some of them received even acts of their martyrdom, that is, a narrative was written, like, for example, for Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna, like for the martyrs of Lyon in France, or for Perpetua and Felicitas in Carthage in Northern Africa. But we have very few of those texts remaining. Parallelly to that, in order to keep alive the memory of those martyrs, the churches very soon established calendars of the feasts of martyrs to be celebrated. Here also, we have kept some of those early calendars. And later on, even martyrologies were composed. Martyrologies are essentially compilations of various calendars. And the most important one is the so-called Hieronymian martyrology, a general martyrology, so remembering the martyrdom of so many martyrs all over the church, east and west. Now, after the edict of Constantine, the cult of martyrs grew in an exponential way. For example, Pope Damasus made big transformations in the catacombs with inscriptions engraved on stone in order to honor the martyrs and to promote their cult. In that time, after Constantine, we have no more martyrs, but many churches will be eager to keep relics of martyrs. And also in the very places where martyrs were buried, there was a curiosity of the public to know, but how did this martyr die? What do we know about his life and so on? So in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries and later on, passions of those martyrs were written. So narratives narrating how those martyrs were killed. In those narratives, you find maybe 2 historical points, which are the date or the day of the calendar when the martyr was properly martyred, so his anniversary, and the place where he's buried. All the rest was invented, written like that to satisfy the curiosity of the devotees, but there was absolutely no historical basis in those narratives. So to take the example of the Roman martyrs, we have 40 narratives of 40 different Roman martyrs. They are all part of that category of invented, we can say so, narratives. Now, another problem after Constantine was that there were no more martyrs, since it was a peace of the church, so no more reasons to persecute Christians. Yes, but some Christians wanted to get the perfect statute of the martyrdom, which ensured the direct beatific vision after your death. So how could one still enjoy this statute? Well, this point was reflected, of course, and so people, in a way, we find that in some early lives, but even if you embrace the ascetic life, for example, to be a monk, a hermit, that was a kind of daily martyrdom. So it was also a valuable way of reaching that statute. And also, so those monks, those ascetics were honored with a cult. After them, some bishops, some missionaries, kings and queens along the Middle Ages. So the cult of saints grew exponentially. It grew in large part thanks to the cult of the relics. We do not imagine nowadays how important were relics from the late antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. Every monastic institution, church, cathedral, tried to obtain some important relics in order, of course, to grow in prestige and to attract many pilgrims. Many pilgrims meant also, of course, many offerings, and so prosperity. Now, for the people, the cult of relics, I think that this painting by the Flemish painter Lieferings tells us everything. That is, in a time when you had nothing like a scientific medicine, relics of saints were the ultimate remedy to so many illnesses. And so this image shows us how all those sick people, crippled, handicapped, and so on, tried to enter in contact with the reliquary, which you see is above the altar. They try to touch it. Some will try to get some dust and put it in a glass of water and drink that water. Some will take some oil from the lamp which burns in front and in order to anoint their wounds. So really, the cult of relics was present everywhere. Now, it's also a period when many lives of saints will be written, not only lives, but also narratives of the invention of the relics, of the translations of the relics, of miracles occurred, which occurred at that moment, and so on. So a huge literature, which so develops from the late antiquity up to the very end of the Middle Ages. If we try to count the number of texts relating to saints composed in Latin before 1500, we reach a number above 12,000 texts, 12,000 different texts, which were copied in many manuscripts. So you can have one text which is witnessed nowadays still by several tens or sometimes hundreds of manuscripts. If we take, for example, the very famous life of Saint Martin by Sulpicius Severus, so that life has been kept until now. It has been transmitted in several hundreds of manuscripts. So those manuscripts were usually legendaries. What is a legendary? It is a huge volume, normally written on parchment, so folio size or still bigger, which contains hundreds of different lives of saints, usually in the order of the calendar. And that was for the use of the monks. So every important monastery would own a legendary. And that legendary could consist in several volumes. In the 12 and 13th centuries, the in big Cistercian abbeys in Austria, you find legendaries which consisted in 6 huge volumes. So each volume meaning really so many hundreds of sheep in order to obtain the parchment necessary to copy those lives. So of course, those manuscripts cost a lot of money to make. Now, in the 13th century, a new phenomenon occurs. What happens in the 13th century? You remember the birth of the mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans. Those are not settled anymore in a fixed way in a monastery, but they live in convents in cities, and they move around. They move around to preach. And the Dominicans are known as the order of preachers. Now, when you preach, you need some good examples. And where can you find better examples than in the lives of saints? But imagine a poor preacher who has to carry with him one or several of those huge volumes, which could weigh something like 10 kilos each. So that was impossible. So some Dominicans then wrote compilations, shortened lives, so that you could have really the lives of the main saints of the year contained in one portable, normal size volume. So that was not anymore a huge volume of 10 kilo, but that was something which was much more manageable. And of course, the most well-known of those compilations is the Legenda Aurea, the Golden Legend by James of Voragine, written in the end of the 13th century. It was a huge bestseller. We know nowadays more than 1,000 manuscripts containing 1,000 medieval manuscripts containing the Golden Legend. And from the invention of printing, so during the first 50 years, which define what we call incunables, so we know more than 100 editions, incunable editions of the Legenda Aurea. Here on the screen, you see an edition, an illustrated edition, which translated in Low German, which is kept in our library. So while you had hundreds of editions during the first years of typography, of printing, you only have one edition of the old long lives. That is, of course, a selection, but in 2 big volumes, incunable, by Mombritius, an Italian from Milan. So after this small introduction on the cult of saints, of relics, and the development of hagiographic literature, we pass to our second part, the birth of critical hagiography. So hagiography is an ambiguous word. Until now, in this first part, we have spoken of hagiographic works, that is, lives of saints, passions of martyrs, which are defined by their hagiographic literary genre. They try, of course, to exalt and in all possible ways their hero. But now there is a discipline which will develop, which we try to study and analyze that hagiographic literature. And so to distinguish that discipline, we call it critical hagiography. Critical hagiography was made necessary in large part by reform. You know that Luther and Calvin, the reformers, put into question the cult of saints, the cult of relics. Here, Calvin, you have the title page of an edition here of his famous Traité des Reliques, which is a very severe criticism of the cult of relics in the Catholic Church. And so there was the question of, by the Catholics, of course, had to defend the cult of saints. They had to keep proposing lives of saints, but in the Catholic side, people were well aware that not all the lives had the same historical value, and that really some texts that was well known already, even in the Antiquity, but some texts were not trustworthy at all. And so you didn't have to, really to increase the criticism of the Protestants. So it was necessary to propose to the faithful texts which could be trustworthy. So what would have been a good criterion, they asked, to judge which lives of saints could be trustworthy? The answer is, or the answer was at that time, the author of the life. Many lives are anonymous. We do not know who wrote them. So it was thought, let us put them aside. But then other lives were written by very well-known authors, even saints. For example, there were several lives of martyrs written by Saint Ambrose. And so it was thought, when you have such an author full of authority, then we can propose his life. And that was the idea of two scholars who will propose a collection of lives, and at the mid of the 16th century and in the second half of the 16th century. The first one was Lippomano. Lippomano was an Italian bishop of Verona and then of Bergamo. And so he proposed, he started to collect lives a bit everywhere from well-known author. And when he had enough, he published a first volume. And the title is Sanctorum Vitae per gravissimos et probatissimos auctores conscripte. So, lives of saints written by authors, by very serious and absolutely trustworthy authors. And so the first volume, published in 1551, contains 163 texts. Since it was successful, Lippomano continued. He collected more lives, and each time he had enough, he printed a volume. So the collection is not systematically ordered. It's just a little pragmatic. It contains 8 volumes. These are the small volumes on the right of the image. Then another, yes, I would I should add that Lippomano worked in an explicitly apologetic purpose. That is, he wanted clearly to defend the cult of the saints and to defend the Catholic faith. So his collection had really that purpose. That's why at the beginning of each volume, you find an index which is the title I translate, Index of the Elements in the Following Lives of Saints, which can be used against the heretics of our time in favor of the truth of the Catholic dogmas. And it was ordered by topics, by the very topics which were questioned by the Protestants. So the various sacraments, purgatory, the tradition, and so on. After Lippomano, soon after him, another collection was started by a Carthusian from Cologne in Germany, Lorenz Sauer, with his Latinized name Surius. And Surius proposed a collection. These are the big volumes on the left side, 6 volumes ordered in the order of the feasts of the saints in the calendar. So each volume contains 2 months. The title, De Probatis Sanctorum Historis. Again, you see that element. It is about the histories of the saints, which are really trustworthy. Here also, Surius has a clearly apologetic purpose. And since he's aware that even if he retained only lives from secure authors, he sees that, well, some of those lives are not very well written. The Latin is not very good. So what did he do? He rewrote them in a better style. That's a little problem, no, nowadays for a historian. Anyway, but not only that, but sometimes he saw that, oh, this miracle was really ridiculous, or this passage was not very edifying. So let us drop it. So he dropped several passages like that without acknowledging it. Well, he says it in the preface of his collection, but of course, that would be considered soon as a real problem. And actually, it was considered as a real problem by a Jesuit in the beginning of the 17th century. The name of a Jesuit, Heribert Rosweyde. Rosweyde was a Jesuit originally from Utrecht in today's Netherlands. And he was living in Antwerp, in Flanders. And Rosweyde was really his hobby was to go around in monasteries in all over Belgium to visit the libraries and to look for hagiographic manuscripts, to look for those big legendaries I showed you. And he would make a list, a catalog of all the texts relating to saints, and he would copy those texts. So Rosweyde had in his room a huge collection of copies, handwritten copies of lives of saints, which he copied from medieval manuscripts. And from there, he started to elaborate a new project, which he exposes in this little book published in 1607, called Fasti Sanctorum, quorum vitae in Belgicis bibliothecis manuscriptae. That is, a list of the saints whose lives are kept as manuscripts in Belgian libraries. Roswade was not happy with Surius' habit of rewriting the lives, of dropping passages, and so on. Roswade was a very modern mind, and he said, we must respect the text of the manuscripts. That's the first condition. Actually, the approach of Roswade, we see here that we enter a new century. Actually, the 16th century is still very much apologetic in its purpose. Now that the reform is already a bit away, it belongs to the past. Surely Roswade is a committed Jesuit and committed to the Catholic faith, but his mind is more, we would say, scientific, philological. He wants to publish the texts as they are, and whatever the author, of the authority of the author, Roswade is interested in all the lives, in the lives of all the saints. So if we know the author or we don't know him, he is trustworthy or not, this is not important. Let us collect those lives. And so he projects this big enterprise of publishing all the monumenta, the documents relating to all the saints. So his main criterion is not the author anymore, but because also Roswade was well aware that many lives of saints claim to be written by a famous author, but are not. And I was giving the example of Saint Ambrose. Many lives or passions of martyrs claim to be written by Ambrose, but were not written by him. And we have often that case in hagiography. So the criterion which was chosen by Lippomano and Surius was not satisfying. So the first step for Roswade is to gather all the documentation and to have trustworthy editions based on the manuscripts and respecting the manuscripts. That was a big project, and Roswade started publishing the Vitae Patrum, that is the whole literature concerning the fathers of the desert, Saint Anthony, the lives written by Saint Jerome, the apophthegmata of the fathers, and so on. So it's a very big volume of more than 1,000 pages, made according to those criteria, based on, for each text, possibly on several manuscripts, in order to obtain really a trustworthy editions. But Roswade died in 1629 without having started the big project he had announced. And so the project was taken over by his two confrères, Jean Bolland on the left and Gottfried Henskens on the right. Bolland was the first one, and after a while, and you will see why, he asked to have a help. And so Henskens, Henschenius, Latinized, came to help him. Bolland's project was based on the idea of Roswade, but Bolland enlarged the project hugely. First, well, he said, there are many saints for whom we have no life. Roswade planned only to publish texts, to publish lives of saints. But Bolland said, for many saints, we have no life. We just know the name of the saint and the date of his anniversary. For example, if we take, I mentioned at the beginning, calendars and martyrologies. So if you take the big Hieronymian martyrology, it contains hundreds of names, many of whom are known only by that martyrology. So we know from the martyrology the date, the place of the burial, but we have no detail about the martyrdom. We have no text. Bolland said, why should we drop those saints? We should also include them in the collection. So his idea is really to include all the saints from the whole Christian world. So a real encyclopedic mind he had and project. Then not only the lives of the saints, but also the other literature relating to them. For example, we have inventions of relics. We have narratives of the translation of relics. We have narratives of miracles. All those should be included also in the collection. In other terms, for every saint, we should publish the whole dossier. And here, not only the best life, but you know that for many saints, we have quite a number of lives. Because, for example, let us take a saint, a martyr, so we have an early passion, and then that passion, for example, in the Carolingian time was deemed to be not very satisfying. The Latin was considered not to be literary enough. So they made a new one. And then later on, they made again a new one. So we have 3 texts. So Bolland says, I shall publish the 3 texts to have the whole dossier about that saint. So we can see also not only the facts of his life, but we can also track the evolution of the devotion to that saint along the centuries, through those texts written in different periods. So really a care for exhaustivity, you see? Now, Bolland would not stop that, and that was mostly the work of Henskens. He said, well, but now that we have gathered the dossier, the sources about the saint, we have the material to start a real critical work about that saint. So what do we really know about his life or his passion, his martyrdom? What do we know about his cult through the ages? Are there some, is there a tomb? Is there some iconography? So all those aspects will be considered in a preliminary treaty, the so-called Commentarius Brevius, which in the collection will introduce the publication of the dossier of the sources about the saint. So it is in that way that they will launch the enterprise, which will be called Acta Sanctorum, the Acts of the Saints. The Acta Sanctorum, this is a view of the whole series. These are all in folio volumes, 67 of them, published along 3 centuries from 1643 until 1940, 60,000 pages, more or less, covering the saints from the 1st of January to the 10th of November. And well, the series was interrupted in 1940 because the way, I mean, there were a lot of elements which made that very kind of publication a bit anachronic. But the study and the publications are still continuing in the form of a journal, in the form of books, in the form. So we can talk more in detail about that if you wish, if you have some question. I would like to conclude with the view of the frontispiece of the series, of the collection. This is the frontispiece of the last edition of Surius. You see, it's absolutely classical. We have a celestial court, an assembly of saints. This is the frontispiece of the Acta Sanctorum, typical of the allegorical style of the publications in Flanders in the 17th century. It doesn't show any saint. What it does show, and it is significant of the awareness of Bolland, of the novelty of his project. What did he represent? Not the saints, not the celestial court, but his method, his work. So let us try rapidly to examine this image. You have some saints represented, but they are hidden. They are hidden in the middle. You see, it's a cave. In the middle, we find a cave with figures of saints lying and holding the manuscripts containing their lives. But the cave is plunged in the obscurity, in darkness. So the first figure, allegorical figure on the right, which is veritas, the truth, illuminates the cave so that those small putti, those small angels, can enter in the cave and retrieve the precious manuscripts containing the lives of the saints. It's important to see that the one who illuminates is veritas, the truth. And Bolland says in the preface of the Acta Sanctorum that he and the church and the historian of saints has nothing to fear from the truth. The truth should be his first criterion, which is quite revelatory and important of his mentality. But retrieving those manuscripts must be done quickly, because there is an enemy devouring the witnesses of the past. This is Chronos, the time. You see that Chronos is eating the books, the manuscripts. On those on the right are already condemned. And this little angel tries to at least save a page of manuscript. Then once retrieved, the manuscripts are brought to the other figure, eruditio, the erudition. Erudition is really dominant in the 17th century. The 17th century is the century of erudition, of big erudite projects. Erudition knows everything. So you see, with the look, she solves all kinds of problems, chronological problems, philological problems, topographical problems. Everything is solved by erudition because erudition knows everything. And then the texts are brought to the enthroned figure on top of the cave. She is, we can call her critical hagiography. She impersonates the work of Bolland and his successors, and she composes the big volumes of the Acta Sanctorum, which are piled up here. So you see, really not a celestial court, but the representation of a new methodology, a critical method, which would once used for hagiographical texts, which would become the norm, not only for hagiography, but also for all kinds of historical sources. Thank you for your kind attention. And if there are some questions, I'm ready to try and answer.
Thank you so much, Father Robert, for that introduction to not only the origins of critical hagiography with the Société des Bollandistes, but certainly the longer story of the cult of saints and where we start to see the documentation being established to tell these stories and these legends in that way. Now, we have some time now. If anyone has any questions or comments, you should feel free to use the raised hand function and we can unmute you and you can ask your question in person. Or if you're unable to do that or don't have a microphone, you can certainly type your question in the chat box if that is something that you have. So we have some time now for that. Okay, Dr. Bugsleg. We'll unmute you there for your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Father Goding, for a very interesting talk. I'm an art historian, and you showed a lot of images in your talk, and these actually can be, at least for early times, very useful documents for hagiography. And I'm wondering if the Bollandists have given attention to visual resources for the lives of saints.
Thank you for this very good question. Actually, at the beginning, in the first volumes of Acta Sanctorum, the contents was limited to texts. Then, progressively, illustration entered into the volume. On one side, in the form of facsimiles, that the first illustrations which were inserted in some volumes, that was in the volumes of April, were facsimiles of a very important, the main manuscript of the Hieronymian Martyrology, and of various samples of scriptures. So that's one thing. But then later on, so the volumes welcomed quite a wealth of illustrations. I think more than 1,000 illustrations can be numbered in the volumes of Acta Sanctorum, which represents either portraits of saints, reliquaries, churches, tombs of saints. And the interesting thing is that a certain number of the items represented no longer exist. So, for example, we know of some important reliquaries which disappeared, for example, at the moment of the French Revolution, and but we have the image. And so the only image preserved is in the Acta Sanctorum. Or it's true also for, you know, in the past times, canonizations, Roman canonizations were really very big events because they were extremely rare and difficult to obtain, unlike nowadays. And so when an important person was recognized as a saint, they would, for example, in the main church, kind of star, which would be a temporary thing. For example, it will remain for 1 year after the canonization to celebrate the glory of a new saint. After that, it would be dismantled. Those were huge constructions, as high as the church itself, inside the church, in wood, which was gilded, of course, and ornated. And so we have some representations in the Acta Sanctorum of those, they were called macchine in Italian, of those macchine. So there is a big wealth of documentation, which was, in a way, my colleague, François de Vrint, who works with us as a Bollandist. He's not a Jesuit, he's a lay and committed to the critical study of hagiography. He was the first one to put into evidence this treasure of iconography in the Acta Sanctorum. And so there are 2 articles on this specific matter written by him.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Welcome.
I have another question here from Dr. McLeod.
Thank you, Father Robert. That was a fantastic talk. I was just at a conference last weekend commemorating the canonizations of St. Ignatius and Francis Xavier, and I work on 17th century Scottish Jesuit John Ogilvie. And one of the things that was coming up a lot at the conference and that I kept coming back to was the role of that the Jesuits played after the restoration, the suppression and the restoration of the society, in pulling these saint stories, especially martyr stories of the early Jesuit martyrs and saints, and trying to push towards canonizations for them in the 19th and 20th centuries, as to kind of show this link between the old society and the new society, and the great service that the Jesuits had done the church before the suppression. So I was wondering if the Bollandists had anything to do with that, or what their role was in that work.
Thank you. This is a very good question. Actually, the Bollandists have always stayed away, if I can say so, from being involved in the making of saints. So the work of the Bollandists is strictly scientific. It's a scholarly work. Of course, we have relations of exchange of publications, for example, with the Congregation of Saints. We receive all the positions of servants of God, which are defended at the Congregation of Saints. So we have a huge and almost complete collection of positions here. That's very interesting, of course, but we are not directly involved, surely not. That is, but the Jesuits played a role, even, I mean, the Bollandists played a role in not only for ancient saints, but for example, you know, some Jesuit saints are included in the Acta Sanctorum. And when the dossier of St. Ignatius was published by the Bollandists, of course, it's a very big dossier of several hundreds of pages. They had to show the importance of Ignatius, because the Bollandists were Jesuits after all. But they did it as historians. For example, it was accepted at the time that the only life of St. Ignatius which had to be diffused was the life by Ribadeneyra. And the Bollandists managed to obtain a copy of the autobiography of St. Ignatius, which had never been published, and which they were the first ones to publish in the Acta Sanctorum. So they had really, they had the awareness of what were important historical sources, and they did their best to have them published, even if it sometimes it required quite a lot of insistence to get some texts.
Thank you very much. Fantastic talk.
Most welcome.
Absolutely. So, Father Robert, I have a few comments and questions in the chat. So I'll just read that for you so that you can maybe respond. So Dr. Jason Brown noted that he really enjoyed your explanation of the frontispiece of the Acta Sanctorum, that he thought it was very enlightening. The frontispiece is a beautiful representation of the endeavor of critical textual scholarship. And I had a second question and comment about that frontispiece as well, from Dr. Tom Nesmith. He said, "Thank you, Father Robert, for a most informative talk. I am intrigued by the fact that two women represent the highest standards of critical scholarship in the image before us. That surprises me for a seemingly largely male enterprise. How do you read that imagery?"
Yes, thank you for this. I'm not a specialist of iconography, but I think that in most allegorical representations, allegories are females. Disciplines are represented by, and virtues are represented by women. That's a classic way of doing it. It belongs to the allegorical genre, I think. Now, one, how would I say, one anecdote about the frontispiece, which was designed by a famous Flemish artist, Van Diepenbeek, Abraham Van Diepenbeek. We also have the sketch of the, not us, it's preserved in a museum in Germany. But when you look at the various volumes of Acta Sanctorum, you see suddenly that at the month of June, another frontispiece, completely different, much more religious, much more Roman, with a kind of allusion to the heretics also. And so you just wonder, what's happening? And what's happening is that in that very year, in 1695, the Bollandistes had been condemned by the Spanish Inquisition on the instigation of the Carmelite order, because the Carmelites were furious that the Jesuits had put into doubt their claim to that their order had been founded by no other than Prophet Elijah in the Old Testament. So of course, that's a bit strange for a Christian order founded in the Middle Ages to claim to have been founded by a prophet of the Old Testament. And so, as condemned, the Bollandistes proposed an image which was less humanistic and more typically Catholic. But now, 20 years later, the condemnation was lifted by Rome, and then we see the old frontispiece coming back in the volumes from 1715 onwards.
Thank you so much for that. I think in the interest of time, I'll have to wrap everything up here, because I think some of our students and faculty members might have to run to other classes, but it's always a pleasure to listen to you talk, Father Robert, and certainly I hope that all my colleagues are joining with me and my students virtually in thanking you for such a wonderful and rich introduction to the critical research that the Société de Bollandistes continues to do into the hagiography of saints. And certainly I did post a link there as well. The Society does rely on some private donations to support its work. So I included that link in the chat function for you. And we are continually grateful for the work of the Bollandistes. So please join me again in thanking the Society and of course, Father Robert today for his gracious time in sharing this enterprise with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.